The Haunting of Shadow, when a pet sees what you can't. I adopted Shadow on a whim. He was a scruffy mutt, big and black, with a rough coat and kind eyes. I hadn't planned on bringing a dog home that day, but there was something about him that pulled me in. When I asked the shelter workers about him, they mentioned that he'd been brought back twice. Each time, his previous owners cited strange behavior. I thought maybe he just needed stability, a loving home. Little did I know what strange behavior actually meant. From the first night, I noticed Shadow acted differently. He'd wander the apartment, nose in the air as if following an invisible trail. Sometimes he'd stop, stare at a corner, and let out a low growl. I chalked it up to his new surroundings. After all, moving into a new place was stressful, especially for a dog that had been rehomed so many times. The first truly strange experience happened about a week after I brought him home. I was lying in bed, reading a book, and Shadow was curled up by my feet. Suddenly, he jerked awake, his ears pricking up as he stared at the open doorway. His posture changed, his fur standing on end, and a deep guttural growl escaped his throat. "Shadow, what is it?" I whispered, trying to see what had caught his attention. His eyes never left the doorway, and as I followed his gaze, an inexplicable chill washed over me. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the dark, empty hallway. But Shadow continued to growl, his body tense, his hackles raised as if he were ready to defend me from something unseen. The growling eventually stopped, but he didn't relax. Instead, he lay down facing the door, watching it for the rest of the night, his body rigid and alert. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps a mouse or some other small creature that he'd heard. But that night marked the beginning of something I'd never expected. Over the next few days, Shadow's behavior grew stranger. He'd sit in the living room, staring into empty corners, his head tilted as if he were listening to something. At night, he'd pace the apartment, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors as he walked back and forth, sometimes stopping to growl at a wall or doorway. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. The room grew icy, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Shadow, who had been lying near the kitchen, suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked up, and his gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, dimly lit kitchen. But Shadow wouldn't stop staring. He started to growl low and menacing, his gaze fixed on a spot just a few feet away from me. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, my pulse quickening as I backed away. I didn't know what he was seeing, but the intensity in his eyes was enough to convince me that there was something I couldn't see. I tried to shake it off, but that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear Shadow moving around, pacing, occasionally growling at something in the darkness. It was as if he was standing guard, protecting me from an unseen threat. Then came the scratching. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a faint scratching sound. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Shadow was at the foot of the bed, his eyes wide, his ears perked up as he listened to the sound. The scratching continued, coming from the walls, the ceiling, sometimes even the floor. It was as if something was crawling around us, trying to find a way inside. Shadow started barking, a loud, frantic bark that echoed through the room. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. He kept barking, his gaze fixed on the walls, his body tense and ready to pounce. I barely slept that night, listening to the scratching, feeling Shadow's fear radiate through the room. I knew then that whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. Shadow was reacting to something real, something terrifying. And I was beginning to feel like it was targeting both of us. A few days later, I decided to record Shadow while I was at work. I wanted to see if he acted strange when I wasn't home, or if his behavior was limited to when I was around. I set up a camera in the living room, hoping it would give me some insight into what was going on. When I got home that evening, Shadow greeted me at the door, wagging his tail as if everything were normal. But when I reviewed the footage, my stomach twisted. The video showed Shadow lying on the couch, sleeping peacefully. Then, around noon, he suddenly woke up, his ears perking up as he looked around the room. He started to growl, his gaze fixed on the corner of the room. He stood up, his body tense, and then, and this is where it gets really creepy, he began following something with his eyes, something that seemed to move slowly around the room. He watched it for a few minutes, his body moving as he tracked its path, and then he started barking, a furious, defensive bark. He lunged at the air, snapping his jaws as if trying to bite something. The barking continued for a few minutes before he stopped, his gaze still fixed on the empty space. Finally, he lay back down, his body tense, watching the corner of the room as if expecting something to return. I played the video over and over, trying to understand what he was reacting to. But no matter how many times I watched it, I couldn't see anything. There was nothing there, nothing visible, yet Shadow had acted as if he were defending himself from some unseen force. After that, things only got worse. Shadow began refusing to enter certain rooms, especially my bedroom. He'd stand in the doorway, whining softly, his body tense, his eyes wide with fear. If I tried to coax him inside, he'd back away, his tail tucked between his legs. It was as if he could sense something in the room, something that terrified him. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. It wasn't Shadow. He was lying beside me, wide-eyed, his body trembling as he stared at the corner of the room. The breathing grew louder, filling the room with a deep, rasping sound that sent chills down my spine. I lay there, frozen, listening to the sound, feeling a cold, oppressive weight settle over me. Shadow let out a whimper, pressing himself against me, his body shaking as he stared at the empty corner. I felt a sudden urge to turn on the light, to chase away whatever was lurking in the darkness, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It was as if I were paralyzed, held down by some unseen force. The breathing eventually faded, leaving the room in silence. Shadow didn't relax, though. He kept watching the corner, his body tense, his eyes wide with fear. I lay there, clutching him, feeling his heartbeat racing against mine, wondering what had invaded our home. I tried everything to get rid of the presence. I burned sage, recited prayers, even hired a priest to bless the apartment. For a few days, things seemed to improve. Shadow was calm, his old self, no longer growling or barking at empty spaces. But it didn't last. One night, I was in the living room reading a book when Shadow suddenly jumped up, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the hallway. He started growling, a deep, menacing growl that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to calm him, but he ignored me, his focus completely on something in the hallway. Then I saw it, a shadow barely visible, moving slowly down the hallway toward us. It was dark, formless, shifting as it moved, and as it grew closer, I felt an intense wave of fear wash over me. Shadow lunged at the shadow, barking furiously, but it didn't stop. It kept moving, inching closer, filling the room with a cold, suffocating presence. I backed away, clutching Shadow, my heart racing as the shadow loomed over us. It felt as if it were staring at me, watching me, feeding off my fear. I could feel its malice, its hatred pressing down on me, and I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't going to leave us alone. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed Shadow's leash, pulled him close, and ran out of the apartment. We didn't stop until we were outside, standing in the cold night air, both of us gasping for breath. I could feel Shadow trembling beside me, his eyes wide with fear, and I knew we couldn't go back. Not that night. Maybe not ever. After that, I decided to move. I couldn't live in that apartment any longer, not with the shadow lurking in the darkness, haunting us. Shadow and I found a new place, a small, sunny house far away from the apartment. I hoped that the move would bring us peace, that the shadow would be left behind. For a while, things were quiet. Shadow was happy, his old self again, no longer growling or barking at empty spaces. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch him staring into the darkness, his body tense, his eyes wide. And I'd feel that familiar chill, the sense that something was watching us, waiting. I don't know if we truly escaped the shadow, or if it's still lurking, following us, waiting for the right moment to return. But one thing is certain, Shadow sees it. He sees what I can't, and I've learned to trust his instincts. Because sometimes the things we can't see are the most dangerous of all. After moving into the new house, Shadow and I settled in, finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. The house was bright and welcoming, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive apartment we'd left behind. For the first few weeks, it felt like we'd finally escaped. Shadow was cheerful, running through the yard, lounging in sunbeams, his old spark back in his eyes. I convinced myself that whatever had haunted us was tied to that apartment, and now we were free. But it wasn't long before the peace started to unravel. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I noticed a chill in the air. It was strange. The heater was running, yet the temperature dropped sharply, like a pocket of cold in the middle of the warm room. Shadow, who had been lying at my feet, lifted his head, his ears pricking up as he sniffed the air. His eyes darkened and his body tensed, that familiar look of fear creeping back into his face. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, just a draft. But as I continued cooking, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was the same sensation I'd felt in the apartment, a weight pressing down on me, a silent presence lurking just beyond my sight. That night, I tried to sleep, but Shadow wouldn't settle. He paced the room, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors, his eyes darting around as if tracking something moving through the darkness. I called his name, trying to calm him, but he wouldn't stop. Finally, he sat by the door, staring into the hallway, his body stiff, his gaze unblinking. I lay there, watching him, my heart pounding as I listened to the silence. I could feel it again, that cold, suffocating presence. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, shifting, creeping through the house. Shadow whimpered, pressing himself against the door, his body trembling. The peace we'd found was slipping away, and I was starting to realize that we hadn't escaped. The shadow, whatever it was, had followed us. Over the next few weeks, Shadow's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He refused to enter certain rooms, especially the basement. If I so much as opened the door to the basement, he would back away, his tail tucked between his legs, letting out soft, frightened whimpers. I didn't like the basement much either. It was dark, musty, with a damp, earthy smell that lingered no matter how many times I tried to air it out. One night, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a faint, scraping sound, almost like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I froze, listening, my pulse racing as the noise grew louder, more insistent. Shadow was beside me, his body tense, his ears flat against his head as he stared at the basement door. The scratching continued, a relentless, eerie noise that filled the silence, echoing through the house. I took a step toward the basement, trying to muster the courage to investigate, but Shadow blocked my path, letting out a low growl. It was a warning, one I couldn't ignore. I backed away, closing the basement door, and the scratching stopped. But Shadow kept his eyes on the door, his growling fading into soft whimpers as he pressed himself against my legs. I could feel his fear, and it mirrored my own. Whatever was down there, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The disturbances grew more frequent after that night. I would hear footsteps in the hallways, faint whispers echoing through the empty rooms. Shadow was constantly on edge, his gaze tracking invisible movements, his body tense as if preparing for an attack. One night, I was lying in bed half asleep when I felt a sudden pressure on my chest. It was like a heavy weight pressing down, making it hard to breathe. I opened my eyes, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was dark, formless, its shadowy outline shifting, but I could feel its malice, its cold, suffocating presence pressing down on me. Shadow was beside me, barking furiously, his body poised as if ready to defend me. The figure seemed to vanish, melting into the darkness, but the pressure remained. I lay there, paralyzed, gasping for breath as Shadow continued barking, his eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had stood. After what felt like an eternity, the pressure lifted, and I bolted upright, clutching Shadow as I struggled to calm my racing heart. I could still feel the chill in the air, the lingering presence of something dark, something malevolent. It was then that I realized we were no longer safe, that whatever had haunted us in the apartment had grown stronger, more determined. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a paranormal investigator I'd found online. I didn't know if they would take me seriously, but I was willing to try anything. The investigator, a woman named Emily, agreed to come to the house, bringing with her an array of equipment, EMF meters, thermal cameras, and audio recorders. When Emily arrived, Shadow was immediately drawn to her, sniffing her cautiously, his tail wagging slightly as if sensing she was there to help. Emily spent hours setting up equipment, moving through each room, taking readings, watching Shadow's reactions. She noted the cold spots, the areas where Shadow seemed most fearful, paying particular attention to the basement. As she set up an audio recorder in the basement, Shadow let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the darkness at the bottom of the stairs. Emily listened, nodding thoughtfully, and turned to me with a serious expression. "There's definitely something here," she said quietly. "I've encountered similar cases before, but this, whatever it is, it's strong. It's feeding off the fear in this house." She suggested a cleansing ritual, something more intense than burning sage, and I agreed. She gathered her tools, lighting candles, reciting prayers as she moved through each room. Shadow followed her, his body tense but his eyes filled with hope, as if sensing that help had finally arrived. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of relief. I watched as Emily finished the ritual, the air growing warmer, lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. Shadow relaxed, letting out a soft sigh as he lay down, his gaze calm for the first time in weeks. But just as Emily was finishing, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by a low, menacing growl. Shadow was on his feet in an instant, his body rigid, his hackles raised as he stared at the basement door. Emily's face paled, her hand shaking as she looked at me, her expression one of fear and disbelief. This shouldn't be happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Whatever is here, it's fighting back." The ritual seemed to anger the entity, intensifying its attacks. Shadow was restless, barking at empty spaces, growling at shadows, his fear palpable. I tried to reassure him, but I could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating us, feeding off our terror. One night, I heard a voice of a faint, whispering sound coming from the basement. It was soft, barely audible, but I could make out the words. "Get out." Shadow started barking, his gaze fixed on the basement door, his body shaking as he let out a desperate, frantic bark. I knew then that we couldn't stay. Whatever was haunting us had grown too powerful, too dangerous. I grabbed Shadow, pulling him close, and we left that night, abandoning the house, the belongings, everything. We drove aimlessly, desperate to escape, to put as much distance between us and that malevolent presence as possible. Months later, I found a small apartment in another town, far from the house, the apartment, the shadows that had haunted us. Shadow was calm again, his playful spirit restored, no longer growling or barking at unseen forces. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch him staring into the darkness, his ears pricked, his body tense. And I'd feel that familiar chill, the cold, oppressive presence lingering, watching, waiting. I knew then that we'd never truly escaped. The shadow was still with us, lurking in the corners, biding its time. And I realized that it would never leave, that it would follow us, haunting us, feeding off our fear. But I'd learned to live with it, to accept its presence, knowing that Shadow was there, protecting me, sensing what I couldn't see. Because sometimes, the things we can't see are the ones that haunt us the most, the ones that never truly let us go. Thank you for joining us for this chilling story of a loyal pet sensing the paranormal. If you've ever had a pet that seemed to see or sense something invisible, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more unsettling stories of the unknown. Remember, sometimes our pets can protect us from things we'll never truly understand. Until next time, stay safe and trust your pets. They might just be seeing what you can't.